Perfect.
All right, welcome everybody. We are going to give people just a few minutes to get settled in for today's webinar, Sticks and Stones, the language we use to talk about sexual violence matters. So all right, we do want to do a little bit of testing for our webinar chat. Everybody should be able to use it, but if we want to say hello, let us know where you're from and let us know your role. That would be amazing. As people are getting settled, I'm already starting to see lots of familiar names on the call today. So thanks for being with us. Give people another minute and then we'll get started. Y'all. Okay, I have 1 o'clock. Welcome back, everyone. We've had a little bit of a break from TASA's webinar, so thanks for joining us for our spring webinars starting today. We will also have another one in May, and then we will have another series for y'all in June and July. So I am Crystal Garcia. I'm the content coordinator here at TASA. Just going to take care of a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to our speakers. We are going to be recording today's session for YouTube, so please be mindful of that. We are going to have an interactive session today. We will have your microphones enabled. We just ask that you keep those muted when you are not interacting with our participants. We are also going to be issuing 1.5 hours of continuing education credit for that. That certificate will come to you in about a week with the information on how to access today's recording. So if you are in need of ours, we do send that out to quite a few people, so sometimes it doesn't make it all the way to your inbox. Please follow up with me and let me know so we can get you that certificate. Today's session is going till about 2:30. If you happen to leave early or can't stay for the whole thing, we totally understand. Schedules happen. Please just take a minute to complete the exit evaluation before you go. So when you close out that screen will pop up. I will also be posting that in the chat. If you need anything during today's session, please take care of yourselves. But you can send me a direct message. I will also be putting my email in the chat box for y'all to follow up with anything that you might need after today's session. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our speakers today. We have Kristen and Kenneth with us to talk about how we talk about sexual violence.
Thank you, Crystal. Good afternoon, everybody. We are K Training and Consulting, and we're here to present Sticks and Stones, the language we use to talk about sexual violence matters. We're really excited to be here talking with all of you today, and we're just going to quickly introduce ourselves and then get right into the presentation. My name is Kristen Daly. I'm one of two co-founders at K Training and Consulting. I've been a credentialed victim advocate and a crisis response counselor for about 8 years now, and training and consulting nationally on sexual violence prevention and response. I'm also the executive director of an organization called New Blue, which works with police and community to co-produce solutions to problematic policing practices, improving empathy and trust. And I'll turn it over to my co-founder, Kenny Smith, to introduce himself.
Thanks, Kristen. You've got to show your pretty picture on the next slides.
Yeah.
Thank you all for being here today. My name is Kenny Smith, and as Kristen said, I'm also a co-founder of K Training and Consulting. I'm the lead trainer for our organization, and my background is in law enforcement, about 24 years in law enforcement service, kind of everything across the board from working as a corrections officer to patrol division to criminal investigation division, and also working in law enforcement administration. I currently also serve as the law enforcement training director for the Arkansas Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So glad you guys were all here today. I know just based on all the chat that I'm seeing of where you're from and the organizations that you represent, that you all already are very much aware of this topic that we're talking about here today. Did want to provide you just a couple of quick disclaimers, and I'll start with the fact that I have dogs in my house, and so they are currently staying at the window barking at something. So if you hear barking in the background, I apologize ahead of time. Also, a couple of other quick disclaimers. Because this is an online format versus an in-person format, we're not able to do some of the small group activities that we would normally do in this presentation. However, being in Texas, if any of you are registered for the Conference on Crimes Against Women in Dallas coming up in May, we will be doing this at that conference in its entirety with the small group exercises as well. But for today's purposes, we are going to have to forego those. We do want this to be very conversational, though, and so throughout the presentation, I believe your mics are unmuted, so please feel free to chime in, ask questions, give feedback. We would love to hear you throughout the presentation. So with that, we will get started.
So the first point that we'd really like to make here is that communication is the foundation of human interaction. And modern society really relies on the media as a primary means of gaining information, forming opinions, and redistributing that information to other audiences. So when the media utilizes language that is judgmental or blaming of survivors or rape apologists, the general public absorbs that information and absorbs that mindset. And thinking about it like a game of telephone, if I say something along the lines of the alleged victim invited Mr. X to come to her room at 2 a.m., where she claims he then forced her to have sex, how does the average person perceive that information? What do they hear? What they hear essentially is she wanted it, she asked for it, this was her own fault. So this presentation gets into that a little bit, as well as kind of the real lack of consent education, and how that lack of consent education really upholds and amplifies rape culture. And it also leads to a lot of potential for survivors to self-blame, which I'm sure, seeing that there are a lot of victim advocates in the audience, I know we're all aware of the huge potential for that. Even more disturbing than the media presentation of these issues is the fact that the justice system, which is there in theory to help survivors seek procedural justice, often reflects that same language that is really not survivor-centered or trauma-informed. And from police reports to individual cases to policies and practices within agencies, there's often an overall message of really a lack of care for survivors. So we all know that rape is a massively underrated reported crime. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but a big one is that survivors just don't trust the police. They don't want to come forward and report because they don't think that they'll be treated with respect or dignity, and they won't be believed. And that comes down to how justice system professionals talk to survivors when they do decide to report. So that initial encounter with the justice system, if a survivor does choose to report, is really likely with a police officer. And that can be intimidating just kind of by the nature of the job. So you're showing up with a badge and a gun, and you're asking questions that might be uncomfortable or embarrassing or flat out re-traumatizing for the person you're speaking with. Why were you there? What were you wearing? Were you drinking? How much did you have to drink? This all feels accusatory because it is accusatory. And a lot of the time, the officer just doesn't know what they don't know. They don't know how to ask the right questions in a more victim-centered and trauma-informed way. So we're going to get into that a bit later, but I think right off the bat, we can all agree that this isn't the most effective or empathetic way to gather a report. And ultimately, and before we get into the kind of the meat of the presentation, we want to make the point with this that words matter because survivors matter. And language that doesn't reflect that has no place in our justice system or in our culture if our goal is to support and empower and believe survivors. And the words that we choose can create barriers and do additional damage to those who've already been through something that no one should ever have to go through. So we can kind of flip that on its head here. We have an opportunity to use words to build the foundation of a culture that does prioritize survivors' needs.
So before we get into this, I did notice, I believe it's CeeLo, you had your hand raised a while ago. I just want to make sure that we can answer your question if you had one. Okay, we'll keep on going then. So as Kristen mentioned, the criminal justice process is not always victim friendly or victim centered. That is my passion. That is the thing that I love about what I do, is getting the opportunity to train law enforcement officers how to approach these type of cases in a more victim centered manner. For me, I can tell you just my own personal background that I was in law enforcement for nearly 20 years before I had any meaningful training about trauma or other things that were related to responding appropriately to sexual violence type cases. I'm glad to see that that is changing a lot across the country, but we also have to recognize there's still a lot of work left to be done. So we have all heard this phrase before: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. I think that we can all probably agree that that is a big load of bull, right? So I want to kind of just go and open this up for some conversation. So let's change this to: sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will what? Feel free to unmute yourself and call out what words can do, or you can drop it in chat if you wish. But what can words do to us? Influence, scar.
This is Kim Olding. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will replay over and over and over in my head until I can't sleep.
Very
Yeah.
good. Absolutely.
We have some stuff coming in from the chat. I'm going to try to get everybody's define me, change me, continually echo in my head, invalidate, break my spirit, scar and traumatize. Words can influence me.
But words can re-victimize me.
Absolutely.
I did see one. So I know that we're kind of focusing on how damaging words can be for us, which is the point of this exercise. But I did see one that I want to make sure to point out. Someone also put in there that words can provide safety if done correctly,
Mhm.
which is such a great point, because yes, as we see, just based on what you guys have been saying and dropping into the chat, words can do a tremendous amount of damage in our lives. But if also done correctly, it can also help bring healing. It can bring support, and it can also bring, in some aspects, justice as well. And so words are absolutely critical. They're beyond just important. They are necessary for working through these type of cases, responding to these type of cases, even investigating these kind of cases.
So we're here to talk about the impact of language, and all of you have just provided some really powerful and meaningful examples of the impact that words can have. And we want to make the point that language is just not just a means of communication, it's also a tool for constructing reality. And the way that we speak with victim survivors are the way that they interpret that information changes how they feel about themselves, changes how they respond going forward. It changes really profound things in their lives. And so as victim advocates, many of us here in the room understand the impact of that language, but the general culture as a whole doesn't often prioritize that when it comes to victim survivors, especially of sexual violence. And we're going to start off with a few examples of exactly how we interpret this information in the context of disclosing a sexual assault.
Hey, Kristen, can I make one point real quick before we get into the examples?
Yeah.
So, talking about communication as a tool, if you think about it, oftentimes in our field, working with victim advocates, working with law enforcement agencies, working with prosecutors, working with all of the different folks that are involved in this process is, sometimes we all tend to work in our own silos, if you will. We are all kind of focused on our own piece of the pie of what is that we're working on in these cases. But if you think about it for just a moment, communication is one of the very few tools that all of us have access to, that all of us share as a responsibility in. So it doesn't matter what your role is in responding, investigating, caring for survivors, whatever our role is when we're talking about sexual violence. Communication and the language that we use is a shared responsibility and a shared tool that we all have at our disposal.
Absolutely. So the way that we talk about sexual violence can frame it as either a serious crime or minimize its impact. And the first words that a victim hears from us as crisis responders sets the tone. So we need to recognize that we're all coming from a culture that perpetuates these biases around sexual violence. And to do our jobs correctly, we need to push back on that narrative.
Yeah, so a good example of framing this as a serious crime would be something along the lines of, "Thank you for sharing your experience with me. Do you want me to go to make a police report with you?" Those kind of statements not only show support, but it does show how serious that this crime is, and how serious this person is taking it. Versus,
Are you sure that's really what happened? He doesn't seem like that kind of guy. So a statement like this really counteracts what we want to do with recognizing the importance of language in shaping societal attitudes and perceptions that's essential for fostering empathy and understanding. Questioning the survivor's perception of what happened to them is kind of the antithesis of the response that we want as people working within the justice system.
people recover from this every day. You'll be fine. Just try not to think about it.
So flip that and say something more like, you've been through a lot. You're very strong. I'm here for you. Showing support doesn't always have to be complicated. Sometimes all the person really needs you to do is listen and say, I'm here for what you need. I'm here to listen to you.
Focus on all the good in your life. Everything happens for a reason.
Yeah, I mean, that's a statement that really minimizes how the person is telling you they feel. And while, the person delivering it may think that it's an uplifting message, kind of put it behind you. That's not what a person going through a trauma needs to hear. They just need to know that you're going to accept however they show up, and just listen, be a source of support. You didn't deserve to be hurt. It can be a long process, but you can get through this, and I will be here for you. Now that's a message that kind of reaffirms you're going through what you're going to go through. I'm going to be here to support you no matter what.
So we talked a little bit ago about the criminal justice process and, the tools of language when it comes to writing police reports and that we use in investigations and interviews and things of that nature. So I want to kind of just go into that for just a moment and talk about what that looks like. Don't have time to go through an entire police report in its entirety today, but I want to share just a few points to ponder when we're talking about the law enforcement response to sexual violence cases. So this quote, reports really can make a difference between justice and injustice. This comes from Steve Belshaw. He's the deputy chief at the Salem, Oregon Police Department. And I truly believe that this is true. This is the case. We as law enforcement officers, whether you're a patrol officer or you're a detective, whatever your role is in law enforcement, we have the power in the way that we write police reports to accurately convey the information that was given to us by our survivor, and to articulate exactly what happened to that survivor. Or we also have the same amount of power to completely not take it at face value, to rephrase it, to sanitize it, to make it less important based on the language that we decide to use in police reports. We have that power to either propel a case forward for prosecution or really to completely shut a case down based on how we write a police report. And so for me, reports really do represent the difference between justice and injustice. Report writing is one of the law enforcement's most basic yet critical tasks. It is our best chance to make a difference in our community and to make a difference in the lives of the people that we're serving. I ask all the time to officers in the police academy, why are you in those seats? Why do you want to be a police officer? And I hear all of the typical answers. I hear, I want to give back to my community. I want to serve and protect. I want to make a difference. You get free donuts and drive fast cars. I hear all of the normal answers from cadets all the time. But in the essence of writing a police report, if we truly want to serve our community, if we truly want to give back, if we truly want to hold offenders accountable, writing a good police report is the most basic yet impactful way that we can actually make that happen. So when we talk about police reports, who all actually sees a police report? How important is this report in essence? Well, there's a ton of people that have access to see these reports. So here's just a few, starting with the news media, victim advocates, the general public. All of this is done through the Freedom of Information Act. Literally anyone in the general public, if they want to see a police report, they can file a Freedom of Information Act and have access to it. While some information may be redacted, you may not be able to see everything. Police reports are public information. Beyond the general public, though, in the law enforcement arena, your supervisors as a law enforcement officer, other detectives, your administrators, along with state and federal agencies, all have access and may see your police report based on the investigative process or whatever else is going on in this case. Moving into the prosecution, moving into court, obviously the prosecutor is going to see the report, the defense attorney is going to see the report, the judge and all of the jury members will be able to see that copy of your report as well. And then police reports can go all the way up to the Supreme Court. So your state Supreme Court, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, as well as state and U.S. legislators, all have access and may be looking at your report based on what the case is and what might need to be decided about that case. By the way, for a law enforcement officer, if your name is attached to a Supreme Court case or a legislative discussion, that is not a good thing. You do not want your name attached to those kind of cases. But for me, I will tell you that the most important person at all that will ever see this police report and the standard for whether I wrote a good police report or not is set by only one person. And that person is the survivor themselves. While yes, I want approval from a supervisor or from a detective or my prosecutor that this is a good police report, at the end of the day, the only person honestly that makes a difference, for me at least, is the survivor. And this is how I gauge if this is a good report or not. If a survivor gets a copy of the police report that I've written and they read that report and they say things like, this is not what I said, they've changed my words, they've not accurately put in here what I told them, then I know that I have not done my job well. I have not written a good police report. I want a survivor to be able to read my report and come back with, this is exactly what happened. Then I know that I've written an accurate police report. So for me, the survivor is by far the most important person that will ever see the report and the person that gets the approval if it was an accurate report or not. So there's a lot of information that law enforcement agencies and law enforcement officers writing reports really need to try to stay away from when we talk about language being used inside of a police report. So here are a few examples. Number one, police jargon. We have to stay away from law enforcement speak, if you will. Thinking about this report going to a jury, jury members are not going to understand law enforcement terminology and code. So when we write police reports, it needs to be in just plain speak that everybody can understand. Next would be subjective, non-descriptive words and phrases like acted strange, seemed upset, and not normal. And when we talk about law enforcement response to sexual violence cases, it's really important for law enforcement to know their observation as a law enforcement officer. That's considered evidence. In a court of law, a law enforcement officer is considered to be an expert witness, if you will. So their observations are very important. However, there's a big difference in how we articulate those observations. So for example, if an officer responds to a hospital to take a report of a rape case, and they wrote in their report, they documented the fact that the victim in this case appeared to be upset. Well, while that may be true that they observed that the victim was upset, that in of itself doesn't give us a whole lot of information. So rather than just document the victim seemed upset, while the officer is there, they could ask more questions with our survivor to get more information to put into that police report. So for example, if they seem upset, you may ask the question, help me understand how you're feeling right now. And then based on the answer that the survivor gives you, that will give us a lot more information to be able to articulate in a report as to what their state of mind is, as well as the level of trauma that they may be experiencing. Next would be victim blaming statements. You all as advocates in the room, you have probably heard and know a wider range of different examples of victim blaming statements. One thing that I do talk with law enforcement officers about, I give the example of asking a victim or a survivor what it was they were wearing during the time of the assault. And so in this context of investigation, it's important for law enforcement officers to know why, or not why, but what the victim had on during the time of the assault. We're not asking that question necessarily because we're trying to blame them or cast blame. But asking that question in general, what did you have on when this happened to you, can automatically cast blame. And so we need that information because there's possible evidence, excuse me, there's possible evidence on that clothing. And that's why we need the information. And so therefore, if we're going to ask that question of what they had on during the time of the assault, there has to be a clarification statement. So I always rephrase that by asking something more along the lines of, can you help me have access to the clothing that you had on during the time of the assault? What you had on is not important. However, there's possible evidence there that we need to collect. And so we can take that same statement, clarify why we are asking the question, and still get the information that we need. Cleaned up language, using words that the victim uses. Do not sanitize or edit descriptive language. This is really important. So I do one of our small group activities, which we didn't have time to do today, but I'll give you kind of an example from one of those groups. One of the small group activities that we normally do is we review a police report. We look at an officer's narrative, and then we compare that officer's narrative to what the actual victim's statement was in that event. And in this police report that we look at, the officer in his narrative writes in the report that the perpetrator forced the victim to have oral sex with him. But then when we compare that and contrast that with what the victim actually wrote in her statement, that is not what she said. Nowhere does she use the phrase oral sex. In fact, she states, "He forced his penis into my mouth." Those are two different, very real different things. Having oral sex versus forcing a penis into the mouth. And so as a law enforcement officer, it is imperative that we are not cleaning up or sanitizing language. When we're documenting what our victim has stated, we need to do so in their exact words, using quotation marks to document the reality and the totality of the circumstances without minimizing it.
We have a quick question
Sure.
in terms of clarifying language. So Sally wants to know, rather than saying the victim appeared upset, could you use the phrase the victim was crying? Would it be considered an objective observation?
Yes, absolutely. You can certainly do that. The point of what I was trying to get at there was instead of just documenting a action or the victim's demeanor in a very minute way, such as she was crying or she seemed upset, I really encourage officers to go a little bit further with that and find out how they're feeling in that moment, because we want to document trauma as much as we possibly can. And so by asking an open-ended question such as, "Help me understand how you're feeling right now," that may unlock a lot more information based on, I mean, we obviously know based on the circumstances why they would be crying or why they would be upset, but they may go in deeper as to the details of that emotion that we'd be able to articulate in our report. And that helps to significantly increase the documentation of trauma. So also staying away from terms of affection like hugged, cuddled, and caressed. And also go ahead and Kristen put the next one up there and we'll kind of lump these all in one. As well as words like alleged, claimed, and so on the terms of affection, this also kind of goes along with that cleaning up sanitized language. I very seldom ever have I heard a survivor use the word "he caressed me" or "he did this." Most of the time, survivors will use impactful words like "he grabbed me," "he groped me," "he touched me." And so, unless those are the exact words that the survivor used to describe actions, we want to stay away from those type of terms of affection. That is consent language, and we don't want to take away power language and replace it with consent language in a police report. And then the words like alleged and claimed. We want to stay away from those kind of words. Those words automatically, we hear it all the time. It drives me absolutely bonkers when I watch the news because everything is allegedly and alleged and claimed. And those words automatically kind of give you the notion that it could have happened, maybe it happened, maybe it didn't happen. It automatically places doubt on this case. So rather than use words like alleged or claimed, we tend to try to replace those with the victim stated or the victim reported. Those are much more neutral type words. So I'm not sure who that good looking fellow is there, but I did hear that if you're interested in the full report writing class that I do, I will be in Dallas in May at the Conference on Crimes Against Women. I'll be putting this class on the difference between justice and injustice. We'll be going through a whole wide array of report writing techniques, investigative techniques, and things of that nature as well.
So now we're going to talk a bit about influencing attitudes and behaviors when it comes to sexual violence cases, and calling back a bit to what the information Kenny just overviewed on report writing. I think a really important point to make here is that the earlier a victim advocate is included in that process, the better, because the victim advocate's sole agenda is supporting the survivor and helping the survivor navigate what they want to do, what they want out of the process, and what will best enable them to start the healing process. And victim advocates really serve as kind of the rulers of trauma-informed response. So some of the phrases that you will never hear a victim advocate say are things like, you need to make a report, you need to press charges, you need to give every detail in chronological order, you need to explain why you were doing blank, why you were wearing that, why you were at this place, why you were drinking, anything along those lines. So the earlier a victim advocate can be looped into that process, the better for the survivor. So to talk a bit about rape culture. So rape culture refers to a societal environment in which sexual violence is normalized, excused, or even condoned. It encompasses attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that perpetuate the idea that sexual violence is inevitable, acceptable, or deserved. And here we're going to walk through just a few headline examples of how that plays out in the media. So here's a headline that says, "Woman gave boy 14 drugs so she could seduce him." Now, as Kenny already mentioned, using words like seduced or performed or caressed or things of that nature are misleading in this context. So does anyone want to unmute or drop in the chat what they think they could kind of do a better job of rewriting in this headline?
Yeah. Drugged boy to sexually assault him. Yep, absolutely.
Exactly. So here we have a face I'm sure many of us are pretty familiar with. This is Brock Turner, who was the person who raped a woman at Stanford University a few years ago. And this headline reads, "All-American swimmer found guilty of sexually assaulting unconscious woman on Stanford campus. Prosecutors called Brock Turner a predator," in quotes, and the face of campus sexual assault. So we're going to just take a minute to pick apart this headline a bit. Starting right off the bat, all-American swimmer, kind of how is this relevant? It makes the perpetrator sound wholesome, upstanding. The article goes on to refer to him as baby-faced and call it a fall from grace, while kind of detailing his record as a student athlete, which really sort of paints an inaccurate picture of him and also puts his victim on the offensive. They used his school headshot instead of his mugshot, which is, obviously a particular choice. And then predator is put in scare quotes. So the prosecutor said it, but there's no need to put it in a single word quote. It implies that the author does not agree with the use or is kind of using it ironically or sarcastically or calling it into question. Another choice could be to put it in italics to indicate that it was the use the prosecutor made. And then here's a bit of a tricky one. So this headline uses the word sexual assault rather than rape. Rape is certainly a more kind of visceral and accurate description of what happened there. But Turner was technically convicted of 3 counts of felony sexual assault. So he originally was indicted on 5 charges, 2 for rape, 2 for felony sexual assault, and 1 for attempted rape. And while working in the justice system, rape is a legal definition. So technically that part of the headline is correct. But the case motivated California legislature to actually include digital penetration in the state's definition of rape. So the Department of Justice actually defines rape as penetration without consent, which is a broader definition and allows for variables such as digital penetration with an object. And it's a great example of the power of language being used, because I don't think any of us want to be the person in the room telling a survivor that what happened to them was not technically rape by legal definition.
Yeah, that's a great point. We're talking about laws across the country. Every state's laws on rape and sexual assault may be different from one another. And hopefully those laws are being updated across the country every legislative session. I know here in Arkansas, for example, the definition of rape here used to be the penetration, however slight, of the anus or vagina by a penis. That was the legal definition of rape. Nowhere did it talk about digital penetration or anything to that nature. But it also, they changed that a few years ago to add the penetration, however slight, of the labia majora, which totally changed a lot of the aspects of our rape cases here in Arkansas. So terminology and language is really important when we're talking about the letter of the law, if you will.
And then we just have one more quick headline example: dad jailed for sex with daughter. And obviously that again references back to what Kenny talked about with report writing. When the media or the justice system refers to rape or sexual assault as sex, it implies consent. And that's something that we never want to do.
So here we're going to watch a video clip, and we'll talk about what your thoughts are at the end of this.
I'm Candy Crowley in Washington. Reliable Sources is just ahead, but first, a breaking story we're following. 2-star high school football players in Steubenville, Ohio, have been found guilty of raping a West Virginia teenager. The story has attracted national attention. The judge just ruled a few moments ago. Listen in.
In this case, regarding the charges of rape, both defendants, Malik Richmond and Trenton Mays, are committed to the Department of Youth Services for a minimum period of 1 year, a maximum period till you're 21.
Again, this case was played out in juvenile court. That is why there is a judge, no jury. He decided on the verdict, as well as you heard there talking about the sentence. We want to go now to CNN's Poppy Harlow. She is in Steubenville, has been covering this trial. I cannot imagine, having just watched this on the feed coming in, how emotional that must have been sitting in the courtroom.
I've never experienced anything like it, Candy. It was incredibly emotional, incredibly difficult, even for an outsider like me, to watch what happened as these 2 young men that had such promising futures, star football players, very good students, literally watched as they believed their life fell apart. One of the young men, Malik Richmond, when that sentence came down, he collapsed. He collapsed in the arms of his attorney, Walter Madison. He said to him, "My life is over. No one is going to want me now." Very serious crime here. Both found guilty of raping the 16-year-old girl at a series of parties back in August. Alcohol-fueled parties. Alcohol, a huge part in this. But Trent Mays was also found guilty on a second count, and that is of felony illegal use of a minor in nudity-oriented material because he took a photograph of the victim laying naked on the floor that night. Trent Mays will serve 2 years in a juvenile detention facility. Malik Richmond will serve 1 year on that one count that he was found guilty for. But I want to let our viewers listen, because for the first time in this entire trial, we have now heard from the 2 young men. Trent Mays stood up apologizing to the victim's family in court. After him, Malik Richmond. Listen.
We'd like to apologize to the lawyer, our family, our in the community. No picture should have been sent around, but a loan is taken. That's awesome. Thank you. Anything you'd like to say? Malik? I'd like to apologize to you. I had your attention. Good, like that. Yeah, I'm sorry to put you guys through this. But it's not. I'm sorry, I didn't want to say.
I was sitting about 3 feet from Malik when he gave that statement. It was very difficult to watch. And you know, something that came up throughout this sentencing, Candy, was that Malik's father got up and spoke. Malik has been living with guardians. His father, a former alcoholic, gotten into a lot of trouble with the law, been in prison before. And his father stood up and he told the court, I feel responsible for this. I feel like I wasn't there for my son. And before that, he came over to the bench where his son was sitting. He approached him, he hugged him, and he whispered in his ear. And Malik's attorney said to us in the courtroom, I have never heard Malik's father before say, I love you. He's never told his son that, but he just did today. This was an incredibly emotional day. These 2 juveniles being carried out right now. I'm watching people line up, and they will be committed today, Candy.
Okay, so thoughts on that video? There's a lot to unpack there.
Why are we only focusing on the background of the African American kid's family?
Yeah, absolutely. So
That's just one aspect of it towards the end of it. But aside from that, there's the obvious thing of their impact and their future being down the drain. Only after the fact of their conviction, they seem really sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
But never mind that girl.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
great points. Anybody else? Tons of stuff coming in the chat. That's a really hard video to watch. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, I think what I found very disturbing about this all was they were so focused on the fact that how their lives were ruined, how it was very one-sided. Not once did they focus on how this impacted the victim, how this has changed her life at this time being. They didn't think once to say, like, you know, justice was solved, or maybe focus on her family, how they were doing. They were focused on the perpetrators and how this is going to impact them and their family instead.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, the only mention of the survivor in this case was the fact that she was at an alcohol-fueled party. That is the only thing that they really talked about with the victim, which in of itself is blaming the victim for drinking, and this is why this happened to her. But yeah, I mean, you guys are right. I mean, we can unpack this. There's a ton of things to look at here. The story starts off talking about star football players, and that, you know, their future is that they had promising futures. They were star athletes. They were, you know, good students. All of these great attributes about these young men. Talked about the alcohol-fueled party. On Trenton Mays, whenever he gave his apology, he made the statement, those pictures should have never been sent out. Well, no, they also should have never been taken in the first place. Think There's just a lot of things here that we could unpack. A lot of bias on the news media side of this or the perpetrators, kind of defending them and about how unfortunate this is for them and such a devastating blow to their future and all of those different things. But as you guys pointed out, no mention about the devastating facts and future for our survivor in this case. So this is just a good example of the media sometimes about how we represent things and how things are biased. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And this is Kim. In this particular case, so since the victim was a minor, they're not at liberty to really talk about her. I mean, that's something that we see with frequency when we're talking about sexual assault is the victim does have a lot of right to privacy. And so sometimes the only thing we really learn is about the perpetrators.
Yeah, very true. In this particular case, they were all minors. The perpetrators were minors as well. And so they did share their information. I agree in the aspect of, not necessarily talking about the victim's name and things, background and all of those different things, but highlighting, the importance of that the victim's individual future and how this is so devastating to that individual versus the perpetrators. We could have had a different focus here.
So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've been actually following this case for 10 years. And one of the things I always find fascinating is there was never any media coverage about the coaches who helped get rid of evidence and delete things from phones. And Twitter was just happening at the time, but all of those coaches got promotions as well. So,
yeah. Just a bad story all the way around.
So.
Does anyone else have a thought on this or a comment before we move to the next?
I think everyone is equally disgusted, so.
Yeah. All right, so we are going to start off with a series of quotes from the justice system that really highlight the lack of compassion, empathy, respect for survivors in the way that the justice system speaks about them. So one of the parts that people have really blown out of proportion in this entire case is that everybody wants to throw the word rape out there. It's very popular, the Maryville rape, the Coleman rape. Nothing that night, never ever of the elements of the crime rose to the level of rape. Whether we agree with this or not, the people of that age in the state of Missouri can have consensual sex. Forcible compulsion is the primary component of the crime of rape. And that quote is from Sheriff Darren White from Nowadays County, Missouri. And that is a quote on the Daisy Coleman rape case.
So this one came out of Montana. The judge stated the rape victim probably had was as much in control as the defendant. This was according to Judge Todd Baugh. The victim was 14 years of age, and the rapist was her teacher.
Do you know how to stop someone from having intercourse with you? Run away, close your legs, call the police? Did you do any of those things? And that quote is from New Jersey Superior Court Judge John F. Russo addressing a rape survivor in his courtroom.
Which, by the way, he got banished for that quite harshly. If someone doesn't want to have sexual intercourse, the body shuts down. The body will not permit this to happen unless a lot of damage is inflicted. The victim in this case, although she wasn't necessarily willing, she didn't put up a fight. This comes from Judge Derek Johnson out of Orange County, California. First and foremost, none of that is absolutely true at all. The body doesn't shut down if you don't have sexual intercourse. None of those things are true whatsoever. This judge was grossly misinformed and misspoke.
You showed concern and consideration by wearing a contraceptive. Judge Arthur Meyerson of London praising rapist Brian Huntley for wearing a condom.
This is a steep price to pay for 20 minutes of action. We talked about Brock Turner's case. This is Brock Turner's father in the conviction of his son.
As the gentleman on the jury will understand, when a woman says no, she doesn't always mean it. Men can't turn off their emotions on and off like a tap, like some women can. And that is Judge Raymond Dean.
Why couldn't you just keep your knees together? And pain and sex sometimes go together. This is Justice Robin Kant out of on the trial of Alexander Wagner.
And that's the problem. She was a willing partner who was not willing. And that is County Attorney Greg Benefiel of McPherson County, Kansas, on why he would not file rape charges against the man who raped Madison Smith. This is Madison Smith and her mom, Mandy. And they are often, when we do this presentation live, a part of the presentation. They will be with us in Dallas when we present it there. If you are interested in hearing Madison tell her story in her own words. So Madison was raped in February 2018 at her college in Lindsborg, Kansas. She knew her assailants. He was a friend or an acquaintance at the time. She decided to, after hanging out with him in the laundry room one evening, go back to his room. She had had one beer. She began having consensual sex with this person that she knew and trusted. And during the act, he began to strangle her. So he strangled her to the point of nearly blacking out. She thought she was going to die. So in the middle of all of this, you know, she couldn't really do much to defend herself. She wasn't able to get away. She was in this person's room. When she finally was able to leave, she left the dorm. She went back to her own room. The next morning, she went to her parents' home. They were local to the community as well. Her father is a retired state trooper. He knew exactly kind of what the process was. She did, and we all know there's no right way to respond to this. There's no right way to report. But in terms of what the average person might see as the right way to do things, and, you know, I'm using that, you know, loosely, Madison did everything by the book. She reported. Her parents went with her to the police station that morning. She filed a police report. She wanted to press charges. She followed everything that she was asked to do. She had a SANE exam done. She then proceeded to move forward with talking with the county attorney, Greg Benefiel. So in her first meeting with Mr. Benefiel, Madison was told that Mr. Benefiel would not press rape charges against her attacker because Madison did not verbally revoke consent in the middle of being strangled. So clearly there was a lack of education on his part, but she chose to pursue it. She asked to have her parents come back into the room. He said it again to them. And that leads us to the next beautiful quote from Mr. Benefiel, that what happened to Madison was not rape, it was immature sex. And I just want to give a quick disclaimer that we're about to show a photo. So please feel free to turn your screen off, walk away if you'd prefer not to view it. But this is the photo of Madison's neck after she was assaulted. I don't know how many of us in the room have specific training or experience with strangulation. You have to press extremely, extremely hard to leave marks like this. Oftentimes in cases of strangulation, there are no marks. There are no external indicators that the person was strangled. the fact that these bruises are so visible on Madison is an indication of exactly how hard he was pushing down on her throat. And Madison she felt essentially more traumatized by the way she was treated in the reporting process than by what happened to her. So she chose to fight. She chose to push back as hard as she could. She compiled a team of experts to work on her case. I was very, grateful to be a part of that team. And what she decided to do was, Kansas is one of a few states that has a citizens grand jury law. So essentially, people can petition registered voters within the county to call their own citizens grand jury. So we did that. We went through that process. Madison was granted her grand jury. Unfortunately, they did not return additional charges, but her case attracted national and international media attention. And she felt like she got to say her piece. She got some measure of closure. She is doing wonderfully now. She's actually in school to pursue becoming a SANE nurse. She's married, she's happy, and she really attributes all of that to standing up for herself when the justice system treated her with very little compassion or dignity or respect. So we are now at a really kind of fun part of our presentation where we would like to collaborate with all of you and think about how we use language within the context of sexual violence, and what are some words that we'd like to see go out of favor, go out of use. What can we replace them with? And I think, Crystal, please weigh in, but is the best way to do this to just have everyone on mic or drop in the chat as we've been doing? Or is there a way?
We can do a little bit of both. Yeah, everybody's still got access to mics, and then I can watch chat for you.
Perfect.
Awesome. So yeah, what are some words or phrases that we would like to see go away, and how would we replace them? I don't think there's a way for us to write them on the screen as we go through here. Crystal, are we able to, when you send out the follow-up on this, is a transcript of the chat?
Yes.
Something that you can send out? Awesome.
I can enable a whiteboard for us if that would work for the audience too. So
Okay.
That would be great.
I've not used that feature before, so that'd be fun.
it is going to stop your screen share, but we'll be able to get y'all connected back in just a
Oh,
second.
Oh,
okay.
yes, that sounds
Yeah.
good.
Okay, so we have options. Y'all can use the whiteboard and type in there. There's also stickies and things like that that y'all can use, symbols, images, or I can watch chat, or you still have access to microphones.
And if anyone would like kind of an example of what we're talking about, for example, the media often uses choked when they actually mean strangled. Oh, and I see we just got our first one. So Molly says replace had sex to sexually assaulted.
Mhm.
Ooh, good one, Samantha. Stop saying he said, she said.
Impending of breath. Yeah. It also kind of goes with choking as well. Choking is being strangled, and choked are two different things.
Oh, and Savannah says, stop saying date rape. It was rape. No need to try to qualify it. Absolutely. And again, for anyone who's going to be in Dallas in a few weeks, Kenny and I will also be presenting a course on consent, and we discuss specifically the use of the phrase date rape.
Mhm.
More emphasis.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
More emphasis or focus on the word grooming.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Stop saying non-consensual sex and just call it what it is, rape.
Yeah. Absolutely. How about something a little less specific, like when it turns up in a report that the victim or survivor was unwilling or uncooperative, and maybe using something like, experiencing trepidation or afraid or traumatized. Underage women are children, so there is no consent. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, you talk about the word uncooperative there. We talk about that a lot in our law enforcement training classes. And I ask law enforcement officers to define what that word means, cooperative, in the context of reporting sexual violence. And, in essence, what they're trying to say is that in many of those cases, the survivor is just not ready to move forward in the process.
Mhm.
So let's just say that instead, because that sounds a lot better than being uncooperative.
Yeah.
Yeah, child prostitute does not exist. Child trafficked for sex. Yeah.
And Patricia says, stay away from claimed, alleged, and use stated. That's a big one. Stated or reported is a much better way to describe that.
Mhm.
Very good point.
These are really good examples.
I'm trying to get everything from the chat box also into the whiteboard, so.
Instead of
Yeah.
uncooperative, it would make more sense to say exhibited symptoms of trauma or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Instead of date rape drugs, it's substance facilitated sexual assault or rape. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Defining what trauma bond is. Yep. Trauma is such a foundational piece to these cases. And accurately being able to reflect what that is hugely important.
Instead of saying blaming the victim for being drunk, use language like the victim was unable to consent or something like that. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Another one that it goes with he said, she said, but his word against hers.
Mhm.
That
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, yeah, going back to the victim's language, what did they state? It's really important.
And while everybody's brainstorming, I know there are some advocating for use of child sexual abuse materials instead of child pornography. So it is clear abuse, it is abuse and not participatory or consensual in any way. Yeah.
That's a great point. We actually, here in Arkansas, our last legislative session, we updated that terminology in our law.
Nice. And then we'll give everyone a few more minutes to think. And while we do, there is one that we usually like to at least touch on when we're doing this presentation, and it's whether we use the word victim or the word survivor. And I know that Kenny will give you his take on that. And I would say from a victim advocacy perspective, I usually like to ask the person if I'm speaking with a specific person. And if I'm not speaking with a specific person, it's more general. I will typically default to survivor or say victim survivor. But I know that Kenny has a really good take on that for a police context as well.
Yeah, so I'm seeing some of the things in the chat. I agree 100% with those. I think it's up to the individual. I like that. From a law enforcement perspective, normally victim advocates use the word survivor. You guys have heard me bounce back and forth a little bit today. I've used the word survivor and victim both. Advocates typically use the word survivor because that's a very empowering word, and that is our main job, our main role as an advocate is to empower the survivor. Law enforcement, in general, we typically use the word victim, and it's not because we're trying to be demeaning or that we don't want to say the word survivor or any of those kinds of things as well. But we're thinking investigative wise, thinking long term, going to a jury trial. And in that setting, in front of a jury, the word victim tends to be much more impactful than the word survivor. And so for us in law enforcement, we tend to use that word victim a lot more than we do survivor. But I do agree it should be left up to the individual. And a victim is also a survivor and vice versa.
Yeah, I think these are all really good points in the chat. Thank you all for sharing your take on that. That's something we always really like to hear from the audience on.
Mm-hmm. Looks like we have about right at about 20 minutes left with our time with you all. So want to kind of open the floor for just a moment. If there's anyone that has any specific questions that you guys would like to ask or any comments about today's presentation that you'd like to discuss any further. Yeah.
All right, so we have feedback. Not everyone who has experienced abuse identifies as a survivor. Some of my clients feel strongly that they have been victimized, and they feel the term victim accurately captures their experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't agree anymore. I think that, again, it goes back to that individual. Everyone's experience is completely their own, and it's different from anyone else's. And so I think it's case by case basis. We shouldn't have some blanket terminology that covers everything for everyone.
Yeah, completely agree.
Oh, Samantha's asking, what is your solution to the constant push to say, he said, she said? Just curious on your thoughts on how to correct that. That's an old phrase. That's right. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, personally, talking about investigative world, I tend to flip that to consensual or non-consensual. That's what I always go to. It makes no difference what the gender is in this case, as much as it is this a consensual case or a non-consensual case? And so I flip it normally to that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about the he said, she said, in terms of whether or not we're believing the person who's making the report, I would say we know that between 2 and 8% of reported rape, sexual assaults are false reports. And generally we would tend to believe that that is closer to the 2%. And, you know, when there's a case where there's the sentiment of, oh, well, there's no evidence. The victim survivor's testimony is evidence. So I think, you know, starting from a place of encouraging the person reporting to feel comfortable to open up and share their story is a really important place to be. And framing it as he said, she said, or a lack of evidence kind of immediately shuts that person down. So that's always something to consider when working with a survivor or a victim.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I have another question for y'all. This is something I've been getting a lot lately. Now that social media and all of these things are just becoming so much more popular, do you have any advice for advocates working with people who might have a high profile case that's in their local media, advocacy tips? I know it's really easy to just want to hop on and defend yourself or getting tagged in news stories, stuff like that. So
Are you asking about an advocate working on a high profile case and getting flooded with comments about that case?
the advocate themselves either getting the comments or the victim getting the comments, and they're coming in for those direct support services at that time? Like, what are some ways we can guide our victims coming in? So
Yeah, I mean, I see Sally just put in the chat, try hard to stay away from social media. And generally, if it's possible, that that would be my advice. And I know that that is difficult. And, you know, especially when you see people writing comments about you or about a victim or survivor that you're working with, it's difficult sometimes to just put that aside. I would say, depending on exactly what the comments are, sometimes the best thing is to not engage, to report it if it is, you know, way out of line. I don't think generally that it's helpful to read some of the things that people post about cases of this nature, because oftentimes they are not from a very informed perspective. But, you know, if you do, really need to engage, I would, you know, keep it as informative and straightforward as possible, and cut it off when you feel like you just can't go any further. And maybe have a friend monitor your socials for you. That's a great suggestion as well. Yeah.
I would also caution, you know, make sure that they understand that if they are replying to comments or statements that are being made, their own statements could end up being used against them in court. And so we want to be very, very cautious of that. Again, like Kristen said, and Sally and others have been saying, you know, the best thing here is just to stay away from social media, if at all possible. I saw a couple of folks put on here, maybe have friends or maybe a family member who help monitor your social media accounts for you, so they can kind of filter some of that out. But if they're replying to those comments and they said, that's not what happened, and this is what happened, or other things to that nature, those can be used in court. And so that could be detrimental to a case. And so I would say stay away from social media the best you can. And also in the context of being used in court, not replying to any of those things, but having a copy of all of that, giving that to your attorney so that they can address that in court if they need to address that in court as well. Yes, that's hard to do. You know, social media is a very big part of our lives. So that's hard. Two real quick things. I think we have time to talk about both of these. Just kind of in closing would be, Kristen, you mentioned about, between 2 and 8% nationally of all sexual violence reports are what we deem false reports. That's a gap between 2 and 8%. There's quite a bit of a gap there. Personally, I believe that as far as actually just, false reports that it didn't happen, it was whatever the circumstances that they've made this up, certainly falls closer to the 2% mark of that. In my belief, that margin, if you will, between 2 and 8%, that other 6%, oftentimes are cases where the survivor recanted. And we all know, as you guys being victim advocates, there's a multitude of reasons why a survivor may recant, their experience. It could be that they're being threatened. They could be, embarrassment. There's all sorts of different reasons why someone may recant. But the problem is, in most of law enforcement agencies, two things happen. If someone recants, number one, law enforcement agencies, detectives, this is not their only case. They are working multiple cases at one time. And so if a victim recants and say, that's not really what happened, I don't want to move forward in this process. Well, for a lot of detectives, that's just an easy way to close a case and move on. And it gets closed out without any follow-up as to why they're recanting. And then secondly, if someone does recant, oftentimes, most of the time, that gets filed as a false report, not accurately conveying that they recanted and the reason behind it. It just gets closed out as false report. And so those numbers start growing. But in reality, the vast majority of sexual violence cases reported to law enforcement, even with a recant, is not a false report. There are reasons behind that. So that's just an important kind of thing to remember about those statistics. And then lastly, I'll say this. We've been talking about, we mentioned trauma several different times today, and we've also talked about consent in several different aspects of today's presentation. And we talk about the he said, she said. So again, going from he said, she said to consensual, non-consensual, that is the primary element of a rape case. Was this a non-consensual encounter? With that being said, that is, in the law enforcement world, so vital and so important of why we're documenting trauma. Because if we're documenting our survivors' demeanor, their response to trauma, red flags of trauma, we're able to document that all the way through the investigative process, from initial police report through interviews, all the way up through the prosecution, meeting with prosecutors. If we're documenting that correctly, there's a good chance that you're going to see a change in how that trauma has affected our survivor. And if we have a good prosecutor, our prosecutor's job is to educate a jury as to what trauma looks like. Because when we come down to it, if we're in a jury trial and we have to prove that this was non-consensual, that's not always black and white in a court of law. These are some of the most challenging cases that we will ever take to a jury trial. But if we can prove that this was a traumatic experience for the victim, we have a greater chance of getting a conviction in these cases. So, for example, if we've documented all these signs of trauma and our prosecutor has educated the jury as to what trauma looks like, we may not have a case that we can prove without a shadow of a doubt that this was a consensual or non-consensual case. But if we can prove that this was a traumatic experience for our victim, ask yourselves this. When is the last time that you had a sexual encounter that was consensual that ended with trauma? Those things don't typically go hand in hand. And so if we can convey that this was a traumatic experience for our victim, we can better convey to the jury that this was a non-consensual case, because those things don't go together. And so for me, trauma is foundational. It's a huge important part of this entire process. And just as important, if not more important than that, are the words that we use to describe it, how we communicate it, the language that we use surrounding all of this, from response to investigation, and articulating exactly what our survivors are telling us in those moments. So language is huge. You guys have given us some great examples today of how impactful words can be, both positively and negatively. And so I thank you for your time today. I thank you for your input. And I've enjoyed the conversation with you today.
Yeah. And I would say one really important thing to remember is that ultimately survivors need to feel heard, empowered, and in control of this process. And traditionally, the way that we conduct interviews and investigations and, you know, the way that we talk about sexual violence in the media, it's not designed to meet those needs. So we really need to focus on making the process more trauma informed, and get away from trying to make it fast or efficient, because we need to take the time to slow down and hear survivors' experiences and, you know, validate those experiences and provide support. That's what we're here to do.
Mhm.
And, you know, I know that many, many of you here today are victim advocates, and we just want to say thank you for that.
Absolutely. Ms. Crystal, thank you for having us today. We appreciate you, and appreciate all of you guys being here with us.
Yeah. And do y'all want to give them a sneak peek and let them know y'all are coming back to talk about consent with us in the summer? Do y'all want to give them a little insight about what y'all are going to be talking about?
Yeah, we definitely do. So we will be presenting the consent continuum, navigating yes, no, and everything in between. And that course takes us through a lot of the information that we barely scratched the surface of today. We will get into kind of the navigation of framing it as date rape. We will get into issues like stealthing and rape by deception and other kind of gray area type things that aren't really that gray when you're working from a trauma-informed and victim-centered lens. And we will get into what are some of the tools and skills that we can use to navigate the issue of consent and consent education within the law enforcement field and victim advocacy world more thoroughly and efficiently.
Yeah.
And we will be back to do that, I believe, July 19th. Crystal?
Mhm.
Yes.
So,
All right.
yeah.
And
So we'll
we'll-
start, yeah, we'll open
ahead.
registration up for that in June. So many of our audience is on our email list. And if you haven't signed up for our email list, be sure to visit TASA.org and get on that list so you can get information on registering.
Kristen, as we exit out, do you mind to put our contact information up on the screen? That way, if anyone has any
I will.
follow-up questions, that they can give us a shout out.
Yes, and Crystal will also be sharing an info pack of kind of an outline of today's training, and that will include our contact info too.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so in about a week, you will be getting information. We had tried a different approach with the continuing education certificates and trying to post them directly in the link, but since so many of us are in law enforcement or advocacy and just so many of our computers have to be so secure, we're going to go back to emailing the continuing education and all the documents as an attachment. You should be seeing that in about a week. You will be getting another email from the Zoom platform with the exit evaluation. If you do that today, I've posted that link in the chat, or when you close out the screen, you do not have to do that twice. That's just a reminder for your courtesy. And then in about 2 weeks, hopefully, we will have this webinar up for review and sharing up on TASA's YouTube page. We will be back again in May with another webinar with Relo Share, who are going to be talking about housing options for survivors. I've also posted that link in the chat if you'd like to register to attend. So thanks y'all for being here today. We really, really appreciate y'all. Sexual Assault Awareness Month is coming to a close. So again, thank you all. I know it's a busy, busy month. So sitting down for training yourself is is tough as the month passes through. So we really truly appreciate what you do for survivors and for being with us this month.
Thank you so much, everybody.